Tira, atsedenaldiaren bueltan hemen gara berriz ere, atsedenaldiaren aurretik eta aipatu diren kontzeptu askoren bueltan oinarrian malgutasunarena dago, jakina kontziliaziorako bidean, enpresen malgutasuna, personen malgutasuna, eragile desberdin guztien malgutasuna, ondoan dauzkagun lankidena ere bai, eta ulermena, ulerkortasuna. Vamos a hablar ahora de flexibilidad y de una propuesta innovadora. Ekimen berritzailea da, 4-day week du izena, astean eguneko lanaldia, una propuesta innovadora, decía, la semana laboral de 4 días. Hace ya un tiempo que venimos escuchando hablar de la semana de 4 días, en las anteriores ponencias e intervenciones también se ha hablado de ellas, tanto Alfonso como Leire, pero quisiéramos saber en qué consiste, si es una forma de flexibilidad del tiempo laboral o es un cambio de concepto del número total de horas que hay que trabajar, qué es exactamente la jornada laboral de 4 días. Y la ponencia viene a cargo de Whelehan, que está al otro extremo de la mesa, es director de 4-Day Week Global, una entidad sin ánimo de lucro que promueve la semana laboral de 4 días. Como decía, viene a presentarnos su propuesta y a explicarnos de primera mano qué es, cómo se puede aplicar, qué experiencias se han implementado y qué resultados se han obtenido. Welcome, Dale. Welcome to the Basque Country. Dale, the headline, 4-Day Week, arouses as much interest as suspicion sometimes. It's like buying a flight and realizing that maybe it has some hidden costs. 4 days a week, working less. Why? How? Do you think so? Do you agree?
Yeah, well, I'm going to give a presentation to you all summarising what some of our findings have been to date, and what I'd like for this session to be is for me to show you what's been done out there in the world to date, but also to give a good bit of time in this slot for you to throw questions at me as well, because this is a topic that creates a lot of discussion and a lot of debate, and I'm here to help offer some guidance and some examples of how this is done across the world.
Great, so go ahead. Thank you.
Great. So, opening up my presentation then, so first of all, thank you to the department for inviting me to speak here today, and thank you for the very kind opening as well. I don't know if you were saying nice things about me, but I hope so. Unfortunately, I am going to be speaking in English because us Irish people aren't necessarily very good at any other language bar English. So I'm hoping that for those of you who are following me in English, that you understand my Irish accent, which can be difficult for some, and that if not, the translation will do some justice. So, speaking to you today about 4-day week, it's a topic that's really emerged in conversation, particularly since the pandemic. And if there's any point I want you to take away from today is that time doesn't necessarily equal productivity. And so the message of which I'm calling this presentation is when you don't have enough time until you do. And a lot of the messages I'm going to say will resonate with what the previous speaker was talking about when it comes to work-life balance, reconciliations with families, with communities, and with the environment as well. But it would be silly of me to stand up here and think that I am the one who's helping to lead this cause and this conversation. I joined as CEO back in February, but before that I was involved in the Irish campaign for 4-Day Week. But really a lot of this conversation has been generated by the team at 4-Day Week Global, particularly the founders, Andrew Barnes and Charlotte Lockhart, who are business people and philanthropists based out of New Zealand, Auckland, who trialled it on their own company. And then we have our Director of Programs, who's Dr. Alex Sujin Kim Pang, who is an expert in the field of 4-Day Week. Then we have Hazel Gavigan, who's again from Ireland as well. She's been leading out on much of the communications around our work. Gabriela Brazil, who's based out of Brazil and has been leading out on our community endeavours and actually making this quite an authentic movement. Jack Lockhart then, who's also based out of New Zealand, Rebecca and Nasser as well, who just joined the team. So in living up to our full title, we're a small team, only 10 people. We employ a 4-day week ourselves. We're a not-for-profit, we're a startup, and we're based across 6 continents. So if we can figure out a strategy to make this work for us, I'm hoping that there's learnings from today's presentation that will be of use to all of you as well. Before I go into that, I'll speak a little bit around what we do as an organisation. So we're the leading not-for-profit organisation that has been talking about a 4-day week, and we've been advocating for reduced working hours across the globe. So one of the key, and here's the first insight for you, 4-day week is the catch line, but actually what we're advocating for is reduced working time. So 4-day week and how that actually is implemented within different industries differs quite significantly. And so we've developed kind of multiple differentiators then within our own kind of organisation that have helped to generate this conversation for us. And why are we doing that? And ultimately what we're trying to do is to shape the new tomorrow. It's quite evident now that since the pandemic that there is a rapidly growing global crisis facing us both in terms of mental health and people's well-being, but also in terms of greater societal equity and societal sustainability. And so we look at the 4-day week as a large human-based intervention that could actually make a significant change with regards to some of these growing challenges. And when we talk about shaping the new tomorrow, what we want to do, and Charlotte gives a good analogy to this herself, she's a Gen X woman who was brought up in a corporate environment, spent her entire life overworking and dedicating herself to work. And as a result, she lost out on many of the benefits that she could have had with engaging with her family, engaging with her community. And she finds herself now at a place of retirement with stage 4 breast cancer as well, looking back at her career and wishing that there was many things that she could have done differently. And so herself and Andrew forming this are trying to create a new future for her kids and for their kids after, where parents essentially are able to have the time and space to be able to engage within their families and within their communities as well. And it all started with a trial in a company called Perpetual Guardian, which is Andrew and Charlotte's company, a wills asset management company based out of Auckland, New Zealand. Andrew was on a flight to, I think it was London, and was reading an academic paper which said that humans are productive for only max 3.5 hours a day. In fact, it would seem, even with more emerging evidence, that human attention span is rapidly reducing at a growing rate with the emergence of technology. I just saw some study yesterday to say that the human's attention span is 45 seconds. So you've probably all clocked out at this point in the presentation. Bringing you all back in. Humor is a good attention focuser. But Andrew trialled it on his own company, Perpetual Guardian. It was a huge risk at the time. The company had to engage with the shareholders. They had this huge client portfolio. And this was not something that was ever being talked about. It was pre-pandemic, so even the concept of flexible working wasn't considered, normalized. And what he did was implement a 4-day week policy through an opt-in process of their staff. And he engaged academics from Auckland Institute of Technology in that to conduct a research process around it. And what they found was that there was a myriad of benefits for people, for business, and for society as a whole. And from that then created the media storm around a 4-day week. And Jacinda Ardern, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, spoke about it on her social media one day, which led to a flurry of media essentially looking at New Zealand as being this place where a 4-day week was going to happen. And so Andrew and Charlotte saw the potential there and tapped into it by establishing 4-day week global as an entity to run pilot studies across the globe to evaluate the effects of reduced working hours. And so that's where we find ourselves as an organization today. So we were launched in 2019. We're still quite young, and we went through a pandemic in the middle of all that. And we've had successful pilot launches and results come out now in the USA, in Ireland, in the UK, and just as of last month, Australasia as well. As well as that then, since I've come on as CEO, one of our main strategic aims is to look at implementing global pilot studies. So we now have pilots running in South Africa, in Brazil. The government of Portugal have just signed a contract with us to roll out a Portuguese pilot. We've just launched with Germany and Sweden and the Netherlands as well. And we'll also be looking at then running more studies in Asia as well. It's the last market that we have yet to tap into. And so what we're not interested in is saying that this works and not actually figuring out if it does or not. We want to be honest and reflective in our endeavours about this, because working hours, as was previously mentioned, it differs, and the culture around working hours and work differs depending on the country and the continent. So where we will be moving to is actually seeing, when we implement a reduced working hour policy in some companies in different continents, what are the ramifications then for the cultures within that microsystem, within the mesosystem and the macro system. And we've been very fortunate as an organisation, because our UK results came out in February, which rapidly escalated the conversation around this. And we've since spoken to 16 ministries across the globe about this. And they actually haven't been our endeavours reaching out to them, they've been ministries reaching out to us. And it's not around questions of productivity, which is where this conversation initially started. Andrew, being a businessman, was only interested in seeing whether he could make his staff more productive. Instead, the conversation has grown now quite significantly. And one of the, I think, parallel conversations to today's conference is some of the countries, particularly in Asia we've been speaking around, have growing concerns around sustainability of the workforce, and particularly how lower birth rates are emerging within certain societies. And so they've done some correlational analysis which suggests that longer working hours leads to lower birth rates. So that's one question that we're looking at, and we will start looking at. Another question we're looking at is the issue of load shedding in South Africa. There's an energy crisis in South Africa. People don't have access to consistent electrical use throughout the day and need to manage and conserve that energy in a much more effective way. But that impacts on people's productivity, their performance, and ultimately on their families as well. So we'll be exploring that sort of topic. In the instance of France, France is increasing its pension age, or is debating increasing its pension age at current from 62 to 64. And the topic of 4-day week is being tangled up into that conversation as well. How could we create a new mortgage or a new pension system and a much more maybe radically different form of funding a pension system? More broadly then, issues around equity and sustainability are becoming much more important. And so actually as an organisation where we originally started just focusing on businesses, 4-day week is now suddenly becoming 4-day world. So what are the implications of reduced working hours on much more of these macro issues? My own background is in healthcare. So I originally trained as a physiotherapist and worked as a physio during the pandemic in acute hospital settings. And alongside that, I was doing my PhD looking at fatigue and sleep deprivation in surgeons. And many of the things that were talked about in the previous session resonate with my experience with researching surgeons within the system of healthcare, and how a system can create a culture and create issues around equity within gender, within different demographics. And so those sort of questions are things that are feeding nicely now into topics of 4-day week as well. As well as that, then my bias is towards the physical health and of the population as well. And so we're facing, as a society, global and rising issues of chronic disease. And so another question we'll start to look at is, if stress is so high within the workforce, and we know stress is a contributor to chronic disease onset, by reducing stress, by reducing working hours, can we actually offset the prevalence of chronic disease onset, either reduce its onset at a certain time or reduce it altogether? And I think that's pulling into that broader question of how we see a lot of these individualized interventions towards well-being. And Oxford University just published research a month ago which said all these individualized well-being interventions, your yoga classes at lunch, your provision of pizzas after the workday or beers, they're not making any dent on stress, resilience, any of the well-being factors that you're looking to have within your organisation. And we work closely with Oxford, and they've said it's these structural organisational issues that need to be addressed if you want to make an effective dent on people's well-being and their performance. So that's the kind of conversation that we're now entering as an organisation. And the conduct of pilot programs across the world helps facilitate us being able to answer some of those questions. Alongside that, then, the provision of that research helps us build this movement. So we are a movement organisation, but we do advocacy, community, research, consulting, and pilot programs in order to facilitate that movement. And the big question you're all having is, what is a 4-day week? How do companies actually do this? And so we actually used the 100-80-100 principle, which was Andrew's principle when he implemented this within Perpetual Guardian. And so it's 100% pay for 80% time for 100% output. And so this is a very simple methodology and framework which allows business people to get on board. It allows workers to get on board. It's a full, experience that can get all stakeholders involved and on board with trialing something like this. And so we've actually been using this now in 240 companies to date and researching its impacts and how different companies are implementing this. We're not prescriptive about how this is done. This should be an organization-led initiative. And every day this conversation amazes me because we're a small team and it feels like the noise that we're making is disproportionate to the size that we are, and it can often feel quite overwhelming. But as of recent, our methodology has been selected within the Australians Committee for Work and Care. We've also been in conversations with many other governments about launching national pilot programs, Portugal being the most recent, but also Scotland. As of recent, with the recent change in the Valencia government, we were involved in the conversations with Valencia as well, and also Mexico as well. So the conversation is growing at quite a rapid rate. And one of the important things for me being a researcher, and I think how we have actually made this movement grow authentically, is to have independent academic evaluation of our work. And so I used to work within Deloitte as well, and the concept of thought leadership and evaluation of work and all that sort of stuff, it can often be biased if it's being conducted by the organization that's doing it themselves and have a vested interest in what those findings will be. So we work, our programs, we provide the participants to independent academic teams who conduct validated instrument evaluation of that. And it means that we're in a very lucky position to have a lot of academic credibility as an organization. So we're the advisory board members with the Wellbeing Research Centre at the University of Oxford. We're founding members of the World Wellbeing Movement, and our academic advisory board, while this is only highlighting some of the members on it now, is actually becoming truly global. So we're creating a global research team who's looking at the impacts of 4-day week on all of their own areas of interest. Our main academic partners then is with Boston College, and we would be nothing if it wasn't for Professor Juliet Shore, who's a leading economist from Boston College, and she's a sociologist as well. I don't know how she wears both hats, but fair play to her. And then Cambridge University as well, who conduct our qualitative research. So that's kind of our academic research. As well as that, then community is a really important part of this. So we're only 10 people. We can't grow this conversation in a way that's going to make a global impact. But you find so many people who've gone through this process want to be able to give back. And so we have Circle and Notion as our kind of authentically growing online communities where we're getting a lot of peer-led initiatives in how organizations have gone about this, supporting organizations in these transitions. And we've invested quite heavily in that process because that's where this conversation is going to go. It will go above and beyond 4-day week global as an organization. And I've spoke to you kind of in depth about what some of those macroeconomic implications that we're going to be looking at. And we've been fortunate, I suppose, to have been quoted by every major media news outlet in the world and to have been interviewed by quite a good few of them as well, particularly with the results of the UK pilot, which were, resounding, and I'll speak a little bit about what they were in a few minutes, but it's evident that media and the conversation around a 4-day week is not going anywhere. So it is rapidly becoming a conversation that CHROs within companies are having to consider, that government are having to consider, and particularly as we start to produce more and more research on the macroeconomic implications, this conversation within the media and within societies is going to grow even further. Finally, then, we return our research by producing books as well. So Andrew and our Director of Programs, Alex, have produced several books either on the topic of 4-day week, Andrew in the case of how he did it himself, Alex who's been researching 4-day week across the globe for the last 10 years and speaks about all the different companies and how they have done it. And then those more aligned areas of work around productivity, rest, the importance of performance management. So that's the whole spiel of 4-Day Week Global, you'd be glad to know, is over. Why should you trial it? So there are 8 areas that we're seeing emerging as particularly important findings. So productivity, as I mentioned, it's the first area where we saw this conversation happening, and that idea of organizational performance as well. But since the pandemic as well, we've seen a lot of issues within the emergence of the Great Resignation and this war for talent. And I think particularly with Gen Z entering into the workforce now, who are fundamentally different to any other generation in the sense that they've been brought up with technology, they've been brought up with access to an international community in a way that other generations never had. They're expecting something different from their workplace. And so it's not unusual now for a person who's Gen Z to have job hopped from 3 or 4 positions within 1 year. And the implications of that for an organization in recruitment and retention have become suddenly quite a significant cost. And that feeds into the next area around engagement. How do you keep your workforce engaged? And we spoke around, I think someone in the previous session asked a question around, COVID presented many opportunities for us around flexible and hybrid working. But certainly in my experience anyway, it seems like a lot of those benefits have started to dissipate. And I think it's because we're seeing this retransition now back into old paradigms, ways of working, while trying to apply these new paradigm ways of working. And so we need this fundamental adoption to just a new way of working. And I think as part of that, 4-Day Week helps to augment the realization of hybrid and flexible. And why is that the case? When you're flexible and you're hybrid, you're never off. So in a way, it's like a mini industrial revolution happening within your sitting room every day. Whereas previously the homes might have been built beside the factories, instead now your work is right across from you. And while your organization might say to you, you don't have to work at this time, you can work whenever suits to meet your needs, organizations could do a lot more to give permission to switch off. And yes, there is legislation happening around that, but actually the implementation of 4-day week and a 32-hour, which tends to be the implementation number, that seems to be a way to help realize the benefits of flexible and hybrid. So people can now say, yeah, well, I am only working 9 to 12 and then 2 to 5, but that's my 6 hours in the day. I don't have to be on for any of those other hours. That's certainly how we do it within our own organization. Underlying that then is that cultural change around how we work as teams. And I'm a lecturer in organizational behavior, and so the idea of building high performance is fundamentally based on trust of your employees. And so undergoing something like a 4-day week actually involves building trust within teams as well, because this is ultimately a team-led initiative. Well-being then is well established, as I'm sure you can all guess. When you have more time off and you get to do more things that you like doing, or you just feel less, absorbed by work alone, you tend to feel more refreshed, you tend to feel more happy. Sustainability then, how sustainable well-being can feed into a sustainable environment, so the behaviors that people are engaging in, not just in work when they feel less fatigued and burned out, but also engagement within their wider community as well. Gender equality, so this is only one aspect of equality that we've been looking at, but actually some of our emerging research now would suggest that we can build equity within other demographics within the workforce which have been traditionally marginalized or underrepresented or unrecognized, under-recognized. And then finally, as innovation. So we know innovation is one of these key skills for the future of work. Work is growing at such a rapid rate, and jobs becoming automated and new jobs being created. And that change fatigue is exhausting. I certainly know I feel it quite a lot. So you need to create space in a person's brain for them to think laterally about and creatively in the future of work. Because if we continue to tunnel vision our way into and in our ways of work, which is facilitated by higher levels of stress, then we're not really going to prepare ourselves to be innovative and to meet growing unknown challenges. So just to delve into some of the findings that we have found, and this is just based off 120 companies to date, approximately 5,000 workers, primarily in Anglo-speaking countries, which is a limitation of this research. And so I hope that this conversation will take new directions as we go into new countries. But the business benefits are well established at this point for organizations that have opted into this process. So 91% of the companies are continuing on with the implementation of their 4-day week, and they have rated that experience as being quite high, so 8.5 and 7.5 for productivity, performance, and experience. When you look then at the implications of that on the bottom line for many organizations, this is the UK study's findings. Revenue rose by, on average, 35% when comparable to previous periods. And when you delve down into some of the more microeconomic findings of that, it was between 1.9 to 5% was equated as a result of the implementation of a 4-day week. So that's including some of those external economic factors that can influence on business performance as well. But when you actually consider that, and the fact that companies are undergoing this radical organizational change, and the fact that they can still grow in productivity and performance and revenue, it certainly seems to be quite promising for us. And only last week I found out that we got our first 1-year annual findings as well. So this is based off a 6-month pilot program. We got our 1-year annual findings as well, and a lot of these metrics are withholding or improving. So they're not decreasing as a result of a phenomenon we call in psychology the Hawthorne effect, where people improve based on their observation of their performance. Why do I think then that productivity and performance is going up? And for me, it always goes down to well-being. So when you have a staff who are reporting greater life and job satisfaction, the previous speaker spoke around how work and life can enhance one another, and so actually having the balance between those two areas can lead to mutually beneficial outcomes. Reduced burnout. In our participants in the UK study, burnout reduced by 71% and stress reduced by 35%. Physical and mental health, reported levels of physical and mental health also improved quite a lot throughout the UK participants' trial. And the fact that one of the main findings we found was that people were able to get more physically active as a result of the trial. People have more time to take up a sport, to go for a walk in the evening with their family, things that they haven't been able to do before. And so that is why we're feeding into some of the more macro questions around chronic disease. And then finally, fatigue reduced as a result of the trial as well. Those additional outcomes then that I spoke about, so there's been disproportionate benefits for all of these findings for women in work and outside of work. So they reported greater outcomes in terms of levels of burnout, in terms of life and job satisfaction, mental health, and also reduced commuting times as well. And outside of work then, we actually saw an increase in levels of parenting taken on by men throughout the trial, double the amount of time by parenting by men throughout the trial. And so we did some subgroup analysis looking at which was the group most likely to actually take the 32-hour workweek policy. And that was young men with young kids. So actually, it's about giving permission as much to men to be able to take time off work in helping to facilitate some of that traditional burden of care that has lay on women outside of work. So really great finding for us and something we'll be exploring a lot more. Climate, from a sustainability point of view then, we found that, and this has consistently been proven across our trials to date, self-reported levels of commuting have reduced on average by about 36 minutes across an entire population sample. And the impact that then has, if you look at if economists do their modelling on how that could reduce carbon emissions, could be quite significant. Similarly, we've looked at what people reportedly do on their day off, and there is no travel rebound. So one of the concerns that business representatives had was that, it's all good and giving people time off, but they're just going to go off to their houses down the countryside at the weekend. They're going to take longer weekends. They're going to use a Ryanair flight to go to somewhere in Europe. And we haven't found that to be the case. We've actually found people are staying within their communities. They're volunteering within their communities. They're giving back to their local communities. And they're using more pro-social behaviours as well. So they're much more likely to use public transport or to cycle or to walk to whatever destinations that they have to go to on the Friday. And that's backed up by a lot of other academic research, which says when people feel they have more time, they tend to engage in more pro-social behaviours. A closer look then, just to highlight 3 specific findings. So Ireland, on average, the participants got 42 extra minutes of sleep per night. As someone who researched sleep deprivation for 4 years, it's bad for your health, it's bad for your performance. So actually to improve on something like that would be quite significant as well. In the US, workers valued their extra day off so much that 70% said they needed a 10 to 50% pay rise to return to 40 hours of work. And so these sort of conversations around behavioral economics and the decision making around how people would weigh salary increase versus time off is a really interesting one that's starting to emerge. And trade unions are now consistently coming to us and asking us, we want to make this part of our future trade our future negotiations with our representatives. And the reason they're doing that is because irrespective of inflation or deflation within an economy, time stays constant. So salary can become, can increase if the cost of living increases and decrease if the cost of living decreases. But we know now that consistently salaries in many countries haven't increased with the rate of inflation that we've seen over the last 10 to 12 years. So actually something as constant as time off could actually be seen as a better benefit for many organizations, notwithstanding the fact that salary is an important consideration for financial well-being of people as well. So again, it's asking more questions as it gives us some preliminary data. And then, as I mentioned before, the UK's findings around burnout and stress as well. But what have companies done? So I'm going to give you some examples. So this is Hutch, which is a mobile gaming company based out of the UK. They were one of our UK participants. And so they're a startup company. They obviously have to engage in a lot of creative thinking. And what they did was employ a traditional 4-day week. When you think of a 4-day week, Monday to Thursday, Friday off, long weekend. And they were able to do that because their operations facilitated that. They did a lot of in-house work. They didn't have to engage with a lot of external people. It helped facilitate a lot of creative thinking within the team, and overall the team was able to design processes, systems, technology, and culture to facilitate the implementation of a Monday to Thursday work schedule. A bit more complex is distribution. So Pressure Drop, which is a brewery based out of Tottenham, implemented a 4-day week for their staff as well. So someone in a kind of a line industry, where maybe the provision of service needs to be a bit more constant. And what they did was they split their staff. So they looked at periods of where maybe productivity wasn't as high at the moment, and they facilitated time off during those times. And sometimes they had some of their staff working Monday to Thursday, they had some staff working Tuesday to Friday, and in some other instances they had staff working 5 shorter days to facilitate a 5-day work week, so a 32-hour across 5 days. So a shorter working week. And in creating that type of model of working, they were able to continue their provision of services. This is Narducci, which is a restaurant in Albuquerque in New Mexico. And they've implemented a 4-day week as well as part of their, so people have always come to us and say, well, this couldn't be done in customer-facing roles. And what they did was actually create a rota system which looked at where were they getting their most revenue and where were they losing revenue. So they actually looked at some of those macroeconomic costs of the organization. And another example is a fish and chip shop within the UK, who actually have received a disproportionate amount of media in the whole conversation around a 4-day week. But it's a fascinating example because they looked at the peaks and troughs of their business, and they actually they decided in this instance to close their business when they weren't making money. So instead of having staff there and having that cost, they had staff work full-time work their traditional hours during the busier periods of work, and then facilitated more time off when work wasn't as busy. Another example of how restaurants have done it is actually they've allowed staff to accrue leave at a higher rate. So if staff can't take it in week 1 or week 2, that actually that's banked up. So across a period of a month, they were able to implement the 180-100 principle. This is Pursuit Marketing, which is a B2C company, and they focus a lot on productivity as part of their, their kind of workforce motivation, and sales. And it's very model tends to focus a lot on commission and individual competition between people. And what they found was actually they needed to fundamentally change their evaluation metrics. So they realized that actually when teams work better together, you can get a disproportionate benefit, an increase in revenue generation for the company. And instead of having people work in silos from one another, they actually created this new model where teams work together much more effectively, and they were able to offset some of those costs. Similarly then, other companies have looked at, and this is not something I endorse, but they've looked at how they're measuring productivity, because that's one of the questions that's always asked. Well, what is productivity? And it's a really good question. I think many of us here would struggle to define what being productive means in your own organization. And that's what's happening with a 4-day week, is actually we're asking that question for the first time, because we're saying, well, if you want to implement 100% pay, 80% time for 100% productivity, what metrics are you using to measure productivity? And so organizations undergo this transformation of trying to figure out what are the key activities that help facilitate the end line for our organization, and we're now therefore going to align all our activities to realizing those benefits. But what a different sales company, was actually tracked staff utility of time on their computers. So a little bit more of a surveillance technique in how they implemented it. And certainly with this, you see different approaches to 4-day week and how different companies are evaluating stuff like this. Another example was some companies have outsourced some of their resources to other countries. And so, as I mentioned, we're not prescriptive about how this is done. We certainly don't, prescribe a prescriptive model. But as we get more data, we're beginning to see which practices are much more likely to create the better benefits. And so through that research process, we'll be able to make best practice guidelines more and more as the data emerges. Then finally, this is second last, Moltefengel, which is a law firm based in Copenhagen. Copenhagen's undergoing a significant amount of construction at the moment, and this firm specializes in construction. Law, as you know, as an industry, faces quite high levels of burnout. And so they actually implemented a 4-day week for their staff as well, which is a billable by hour model. So actually, you only get paid for the amount of hours that you're working. So how did they do that? There's a few different ways of which these billable by hour clients have done it. They've either increased the rate per hour, which might not go down very well with clients. They have kept it the same, and they've looked at those macroeconomic costs around retention and recruitment and burnout and absenteeism and presenteeism. They were able to see, we can make that sacrifice. Or they've, as I mentioned before, created a model where there is a minimum staff available throughout the entire 5 days, and so there is constant contact access for your clients. And then one kind of close to my own heart is healthcare. We have a global healthcare crisis at the moment. Ireland has faced a healthcare crisis for the last, 30, 40 years. But since the pandemic, we have seen droves of people leaving healthcare settings. And not just leaving to go work in Australia or New Zealand or better working conditions. They're now leaving professions altogether, case in point. And that creates a huge risk for society if we have a healthcare system that can't have a minimum staffing level to provide healthcare provision. So something as radical as a 4-day week can actually help put a plug in what is now becoming a huge retention issue and recruitment issue for healthcare. And I'll use the example of Iceland as a generalizable example. They implemented a 4-day week on their public servants and used healthcare participants as part of that. And they actually had to increase the amount of staff that they hired by about 10% in order to offset that time loss for continuity of patient care. But instead, they actually found that they were able to keep their staff. They weren't having to use as much agency staff. And so actually they had a net benefit overall when they looked at the costs of the current ways of working versus this new way of working, which at its very basic level looks like it's costing us something, but actually at a macroeconomic level is actually of net benefit. And something similar was alluded to with the example within Sweden and in Gothenburg. Those very kind of reductionist approaches of just looking at, is this costing us more? Versus looking at some of those upstream issues that are hemorrhaging money for organizations is important when you're considering these more complex organizations as well. So why are organizations adopting a 4-day week? There's 3 main areas really. So they're trying to solve familiar but existential crises around recruitment, retention, work-life balance. For many organizations, they're trying to get that competitive edge. So, the big firms are looking at something like a 4-day week as a way to attract top talent. And some are then experimenting with flexible hybrid working time as well, and looking at issues around policies of equity, which maybe aren't realizing their full potential. And so one question I always get asked is, what do you do with part-time workers during these trials? And again, we don't provide the answer. We think it should be best determined by the organization. But here are my thoughts. Some are reducing a pro rata, so staff are going from a 4-day, if they're already working 4 days, going to 3.25 or whatever. But actually what I think you should do is look at your baseline productivity of your part-time staff before making that decision. And I think what you will find is that a lot of those people who are working 4 days are already producing or are giving the same level of productivity as their 5-day colleagues. And so actually, our policies around part-time work an equitable policy if we're reducing their pay by 20% as is when they're producing the same amount of output? That's certainly been what our experience has been to date. And I think it's a question worth asking of your staff before actually embarking on making that sort of decision. And that feeds into my key insight, which is actually that the 4-day week is already here. And that's because it's buried under so much unproductive time within work. So we spend so much of our time in wasted, poorly run meetings that don't have agendas, that are scheduled for 20 minutes and go on for 60 minutes, by disruptions and interruptions, and by badly used technology. Technological transformation has become a pain in the side for many organizations. It seems like every few months, everyone's getting a thing to say, we're introducing a new CRM system, it's time to attend these 4 to 5 training sessions. I think we need to take a step back and see, is technology and our use of technology at the moment actually improving our productivity, or is it actually creating more time for us? So these are the kind of questions that we probe to organizations to simplify and to adapt and to make things all focused towards the viewpoint of one metric, reducing working time. So if you're not achieving the 32-hour work week as part of your pilot, you need to ask yourself, why is that the question? And so what we typically find is that it's poorly run processes, technology, culture, or leadership. So what are companies doing then in order to facilitate that change? They're redesigning their meetings. So some are going from standard 1-hour meetings to 10-minute meetings. People are reducing daily stand-ups and making them into, quick reports that can be done. People are redesigning their workday and actually created concentrated, blocked off time in the workday for people to do their work. I used to work in consulting, and we actually didn't get to start to do our work until 5 p.m. in the evening because we were in meetings all day talking about doing the work. They're outsourcing or automating less valuable tasks. They're using technology to support deep work and not distraction. You think about MS Teams, which has a do not disturb function. I think about this as an example from when I did work in the private sector. I would have do not disturb on MS Teams, and then someone would Skype message me. There was no sense of respect for boundary or culture or the recognition that people are actually doing the meaningful work during that time. And then finally, people are using for savings from recruitment, overtime, and predictability as well. So we generate all our data through conduct of trials and pilot trials. And people are always saying to us, how do we know this is going to work? And we can't say it's going to work unless you pilot it. That's the same with every single endeavor that you do with organizational change. And pilots are lovely because they're flexible, they're adaptable. Nothing has to be set down in stone from day one. And that allows you to experiment with new things and to fail fast and to learn and to iterate. And what you're doing is facilitating a change in mindset within your organizations as well. Carol Dweck, who's a leader in the field of organizational psychology and behavior, speaks about the need for organizations to go from fixed mindsets to growth mindsets, and actually facilitating this organizational change, which inherently has a vested benefit for employees, is how you can help facilitate the development of that growth mindset. Because you look at other endeavors around productivity within the workplace, like lean ways of working, Lean Six Sigma, Scrum, all these sort of things. Realizing the benefits of those, think about it yourself, honestly. In my experience, having used those sort of methodologies, it's simply to make things more efficient so that I can get more work thereafter. So why am I intrinsically motivated to do something that's only going to create more work for me by saving that time? Whereas in this endeavor, you're saying, get your work done quicker and you get time off. So you're reestablishing a psychological contract with your worker, which says there is mutual benefits in this endeavor for both of us. But that endeavour can only be realised if you give us the return of productivity and performance, and then we give you, in return, the granting of time off. And finally, the value of trials is that it allows you to hedge against failure. So you say to organisations, and how you communicate to an organisation is that this is an experiment, and this will probably not get right, first of all, and we don't know if this is going to work. It's in everyone's interest to probably try and make it work. But ultimately, at the end, you can end the trial if it's not working. And we have seen 9% of companies do that, albeit a very small percentage. And the reasons why those organisations have not continued is either insufficient planning, not informing stakeholders or shareholders that they were going to embark on this journey, changes in leadership, under-recognising the significant change that's required actually to make this work. This is not as simple as just implementing a 4-day week, day one, and it all goes well and rosy. You need to have good communications and good expectations around what is to be expected. And so all those things allow you to hedge against failure. And so what we do is coordinate those 6-month trials, and we facilitate the development of capability within change management and org design by giving people training, mentoring, network, and research access. So we have a pilot program, which is normally done on a national level, though now it's been expanded for any company who wants to trial. They embark on an onboarding phase where they've decided they want to do this, and then they have all the questions. So we answer all those questions for them and get them to figure out how they're going to do it. And then we provide we allow them to conduct kind of the development of a communications plan and stakeholder management plan through the peer support network that's available to them. And then the research is conducted by Boston College and Cambridge then at baseline, mid, and final assessment. So they're able to get executive findings on how their company is performing at that high level. And if they so wish, use comparable data then on a global scale as well. So the pilot program itself then, as I mentioned, as we embark onto new countries, so we take Portugal, which is one that has just launched, and the Portuguese government as being our main partner. We do a series of recruitment and information sessions for companies interested in trialing a 4-day week. We then conduct preparation training and onboarding sessions with that team for between 4 to 12 weeks, depending on the complexity of the organization, and then they go live. They decide how many members of their team are going to do it. Is it all or some? Do they have a comms plan? If there's certain metrics achieved, it'll be rolled out to other parts of the organizations. And then they check in with us as part of the process as well. So we conduct weekly workshops. We have Ask Me Anything sessions. There's peer-led network. And the researchers are there as well for their support. And then how the media cycle is generated is that on the conclusion of the 6-month pilot period, we create a report. Well, the academics create a report, and then we publish it, and we send out a press release to international media who then report on our findings, essentially. That pilot timeline then, the planning phase, is essentially asking those questions that I've already mentioned to you. So choosing your new schedule, what is it going to look like? What does success look like for you as an organization? How are you going to measure the key activities within the trial? What is the worst case scenario here? And actually, what are the red lines for your organization to say, this can't continue, we can't continue with this 6-month trial, we need to stop it now? Or what are the amber ones to say, okay, we need to adapt and change? How are we communicating? And then, do we need to implement some new policies? By and large, we have found organizations, independent of the jurisdiction, don't have to make changes to contracts or anything like that, because this is just a pilot, similar to any other experiment within organizations. But some organizations, in order to provide that level of extra reassurance, make it an opt-in process for employees to be part of. But again, we're not advising legally on some of those findings, so it's always good to check in with legal around some of these things as well. Then, as I mentioned, we provide you then with those workshops as well throughout the trial. So to conclude, what are we going to be doing in the next few months? So our aim is to go truly global. So we will have pilots running in every continent by the end of the year. I'm working hard on some company in Antarctica. It'll really give me huge merit. And with Andrew and Charlotte based down in New Zealand, maybe it is possible. But regardless of that, we have a lot of exciting pilots coming up, and the facilitation of translation of our material, which is primarily in English, into different languages by partnering with local leaders and partnerships is helping us to facilitate that. As I mentioned, we'll be moving more from 4-day week to 4-day world because increasingly as governments are interested in this and governmental trials, which are going to be inevitable, they will want to be looking at these broader questions. And we will then be focusing more on engaging with governments as part of that endeavour. So a really exciting example would be how we have sponsored Congressman Mark Takano's bill in California. He's part of the Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party in the USA, and he will be presenting those findings to the House of Representatives soon. And similarly, Senator Bernie Sanders, who has come out and publicly endorsed it as well, will be presenting something similar to the Senate within the US as well. So there's no right or wrong way on how this conversation is happening within countries. Some are going at a much more legislative way in order to build the conversation. Others, like the Portuguese government, are simply providing the funding in order for opt-in companies to trial and pilot it as well. So that's where we're going to be going. Thank you so much for the time, and it's a pleasure.
Lo primero, felicidades por el trabajo que estés realizando, creo que es muy necesario. Me gustaría que hicieras un poco, que ampliaras la información que nos has hecho sobre la sanidad pública, sobre cómo se ha llevado a cabo el proyecto en la sanidad pública, porque yo pertenezco a Osakidetza, que es el Servicio Vasco de Salud. Es un servicio muy grande, una empresa muy grande, muy feminizada y con problemas los que has comentado, ¿no? De atracción de talento, gente que se va, mucha rotación. Entonces, sí que me gustaría que hablaras un poco más de cómo se ha llevado a cabo o nos des información de dónde podemos encontrar la información de cómo se ha llevado a cabo, de los resultados, etc. Gracias.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really great question. I definitely think that healthcare is the most complex example you can think of. If we can make this work in healthcare, I think we can make it work anywhere. I'm actually going to give you a resource that's not globals in order to look at. So 4-day week campaign in the UK, who were our partners for the UK study, did an entire white paper on how a 4-day week could be implemented within the NHS. And it's a fabulous document talking about how you can look at shift work patterns of different staff, both frontline staff and supporting staff, and actually facilitate do workforce modelling essentially that allows you to create a 32-hour work week for your healthcare staff. So I won't go into the intrinsics of that, but it's a really good document for you to have a look at. I think the NHS is a good example. We're working with a trust in the NHS now, which is going to be implementing it in the next year. And I think it's because they're seeing the huge costs that I think they're mainly being driven by agency costs. So agency, it's a system that's broken in many healthcare systems. You have your doctors, for example, working Monday to Friday, and then there's no one to cover Saturday and Sunday, so they're hired as agency staff for Saturday and Sunday at a ridiculously higher rate. And that's just a system that's not working. If you can't attract people to join the profession in the first place, and you're going to rely more and more on the same people to do more and more work, you're going to create more burnout and get those staff leaving. So the entire system needs a complete re-injection in order to not just recruit, which is what a lot of governments are doing, is try to recruit more healthcare staff, but actually focus on policies to retain. And yeah, I think something like a 4-day week as a benefit helps not just to reduce burnout and stress, but actually retain talent as well. Another conversation that's emerging around this is actually, because a lot of these healthcare systems now face those shortages, so they want to provide work contracts that aren't necessarily Monday to Friday. So they want staff to be willing to work on weekends as well. And so is that a trade-off that some staff are going to be willing to make? So that's another conversation that's happening aligned to this conversation.
Este debat.
Bien, bueno, en primer lugar, sumarme a la felicitación por el trabajo que están realizando. Se ve que tiene una base de investigación sólida, relevante, que lo han utilizado en organizaciones de diferentes tipos, diferentes procedencias culturales y demás. Me ha llamado la atención cuando señalaba como principales beneficios en productividad, en resultados, en reclutamiento de personas, en engagement. ¿Esos resultados o esos beneficios se asocian directamente a que sea la jornada de 4 días o podrían encontrarse también en empresas que tengan altos niveles de flexibilidad? Gracias.
Yeah, it's a good question. So as the database emerges, so that's based off a sample of 5,000, but as more and more participants come on board, they're all feeding into the same database because it's a standardized assessment tool. And our economists now are doing economic modeling to look at predictor variables, and they are finding increasingly that working hours is I'm not an economist, so I can't, correct me if I'm using this terminology wrong, but it is a predictor variable of productivity and performance. I don't think that, so you have to look at, I suppose, organizations, a lot of these organizations might have flexible and hybrid working already. In fact, probably most of them do because they're the front runners in this, so they're probably been quite innovative already. So even from that change from baseline to end would indicate that there is some cause as a result of the implementation of 4-day week, probably because of reduced working hours and probably also augmenting the benefits of flexible and hybrid. So I see them as the trifecta of work interventions in the 21st century that facilitates a truly globalized world where you can work from home in some instances, where you can, you can be flexible about how you work, but you only have to work this amount of time. So you can actually go have a life outside of work as well.
Azken galderari baldin bada, una última pregunta.
Kaixo, eskerrik asko bai, zure ekarpenagatik. Nik beste alderdi asko ikusten dizkiot, baina beste alderdi batetik egingo dizu galdera. Betianik, nire inguruan behintzat gizarte gaietan, eta gizartean oro har, begiratu izan dugu Eskandinaviara, beti hezkuntza ezin hobea daukate, ongizate estatua ikaragarria, bizi kalitatea, eta hori nahi izan dugu beti, baina beti kostatu izan zaigu 10, 15, 20 urte gehiago. Esaten dugu, ez dago hor atajorik, ezin dugu lehenago lortu. Horrekin esan nahi dut, hauze guztia ikusita, ez dakit gure burua, gure gorputza, gure bihotza, gure dana prest dagoen hori egiteko. Porque igual egin alda sistema hori, egin alda baita Osakidetzan ere, ez dakit osasun arloan oso zaila. Zaintza arloan niretzat zaiena izango litzateke pertsonak dauden heinean. Baina gu pertsonok prest gaude hori egiteko, egia da hor eman duzun emaitzak agian beste herrialde batean, hemen izango litzateke ere bai egun libre bat izango bagenu, mendira joango ginateke, kirola egingo genuke, irakurriko genuke, inkestak egite dituztenean guztiok behar dugu denbora gehiago, nahi dugu denbora gehiago irakurtzeko edo mendira joateko. Baina gero egia esan gure aisialdiaren neurri handia izaten da kontsumorako, beti zerbitzu batzuen txapon baten truke egiten dugula ia guztia. Gure denbora, gure pantailak, eta gure norberarekiko egoteko denbora, ez dakit. Ez dakit ni, hemen izango litzateken esate duzun moduan, mendira joango ginateke, ez genuke kotxea hartuko, irakurriko genuke, niretzat zaila behintzat.
Thank you. Okay, so I think there's a few points. So yeah, Scandinavia is always used as the kind of the gold standard example. We use it in Ireland as well, and I think there is there's benefits in looking at Scandinavia, and there's huge limitations in looking at Scandinavia as an example to compare against. What we've found is surprising this conversation hasn't actually come from Scandinavia in countries. So Iceland, yeah, with their national pilot back in 2018, but beyond that, we've had very little engagement from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. Saying that now, we did just sign with Sweden as a partner, but the conversation has come from those societies that actually desperately feel like they need this. So So the US was the first to launch its campaign and the culture around working hours. So they might not be actually looking at 32-hour work weeks. They're looking at just an 80% time of what is their work hour week currently, which might be 50 or 60. Similarly, we're seeing conversations happen in India as well. So that's slowly becoming, India and Singapore are slowly becoming the two areas of which we're seeing in Asia wanting to implement a 4-day week. So it's a bit like what's that saying? Lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So we provide the pilot programs to companies willing to experiment and trial with something like this. And they are the front runners and the change agents. So they're the ones generating this conversation at the national level. But ultimately, it's going to be up to government as to whether they endorse something like this. But I would be a bit more confident than maybe I was before I joined the organization that this is something that is happening truly at a global level. So the fact that we've got, I've had conversations with the Argentinian ministries, South Africa, Singapore, Germany, North America, and Australia as well. There is government interest across every continent in this for different reasons. Some are coming from productivity, some are coming from birth rates, some are coming from meeting their sustainability targets, some are coming from some of those issues around health, the health burden on the workforce. So I think that the pilots and the generation of our data through research and the pressure that is creating for many businesses, both within the private sector and the public sector, is making this conversation one that actually many organizations can't ignore. And when I was working within Deloitte last year, this was a completely fringe topic. God forbid you mention the topic of reduced working hours in consulting. But now it's actually becoming something that's trialed within one of the Deloittes. And it's become a topic that talent are demanding an answer of from their CHROs. So many are having to pin their flags to the masses and make a decision as to whether this is something that's good or bad for their business, and stick with the implications of whether that's going to impact on recruitment and retention for their staff.
10 minutu berandu gaztagoneko, beraz hementxe itxiko dugu. Ponentzia hau, del Whelehan, 4-day week globaleko zuzendari nagusia. Eskerrik asko. Thank you so much for coming and being.